The most frustrating part of our ongoing hate crime hysteria is the unfalsifiability. No matter how many flaws in the data, no matter how many outright provable hoaxes get exposed, the conclusion is always it's a moot point because there's clearly a hate crime epidemic otherwise. Never mind that there are demonstrable fakes manufactured weekly if you just pay close enough attention. Just since New Year's Day, a guy was caught after raising $20,000 on GoFundMe, fraudulently claiming to have been beaten by a gang of racist white men. Turns out he drunkenly fell on his face after unsuccessfully playing grab ass at the bar. An Oregon political candidate pleaded guilty to faking a threatening letter to himself about throwing illegal immigrants into the river to fertilize crops. Social media whipped up a lie that this guy was holding a black woman captive to be abused by a racist Trump mob. Turns out he was removing her from a fight and getting her to safety, but who cares about the facts? Get him fired. We need a scalp for the cause. Oh yeah, but these fakes are so few compared to the obviously real ones, the true believers insist, usually referring to the FBI's annual hate crime report, showing thousands of incidents per year. But if you actually bother to look into the data, you'll notice a few things. First of all, the overall trend is downward over the last 2 decades. And this is a raw number, meaning the drop doesn't even account for a growing population, and more police agencies have been participating in this report over time. So more people and more reporting police agencies, but fewer hate crimes? That doesn't fit the narrative that this is some exploding problem. And not only that, but what are we actually measuring here? What is an incident in this chart? Is that a case closed hate crime conviction? No, it's a report to local police. It is a claim. In many cases, we don't know who the offender even is. If we don't know who the offender is, how could we possibly be confident it's a legitimate hate crime? In other words, pointing to this chart of thousands of these claims doesn't prove that scrutiny of the individual one is a waste of time lacking perspective. It only proves that we have thousands more to scrutinize. And of course, it's not just the truth that is a casualty from that lack of scrutiny. It's people's livelihoods, too. These claims flood in way faster than the facts can ever be collected, and during what can be years for the truth to be revealed, if ever, lives are destroyed with devastating accusations of racism or other forms of prejudice, and the response from those responsible for administering justice is, ironically, the soft bigotry of coddling the perceived victim based solely on assumptions about race, rather than any sincere or impartial search for the truth. In other words, we are actually ruining lives while we claim to be saving them, using race as our first and often only piece of evidence. I remember way back when such hasty race-based judgments were called racism and deemed bad. Now we call them social justice. And all of this, the fake claim that was assumed to be true based on nothing but the race of the accuser, the lives ruined in response, the paradox nonsense lesson that somehow all of this outright falsehood is still proof of the broader narrative. This is all exactly what has happened at Smith College in Massachusetts over the last 2 years. It's actually one of those stories that, even as claimed, isn't that bad or worthy of the sort of response it got. As the story was told at the time, file this one under if true, don't care. It's not some criminal incident. In the summer of 2018, sophomore Amu Kanate was eating lunch in the lounge of a dorm building on campus. In her original description of events, she says a racist Smith College janitor called campus police to report a suspicious black male in the common room. And that led to an officer approaching her, but even in her own video posts of the encounter, the officer was totally polite and professional. He just asked her a couple questions. It was her who escalated the encounter into some sort of racist incident.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
We were wondering why you were here.
Oh, I was eating lunch. I'm working the summer program, so I was just relaxing on my
Oh,
couch.
you just taking a break?
Yeah.
So you're with one of the summer programs?
Yeah, I'm actually a TA. Okay.
So that's what it was.
Alright.
He just had to keep from the doorway. He didn't know who it was. And once it's over with, so it's probably...
Yeah, I it's okay. It's just like kind of stuff like this happens way too often where people just feel like threatened.
Now, sure, it may not seem that bad simply to be asked a few polite and apologetic questions by a campus cop. Sure, the story, as documented, shows absolutely no evidence of racism or discrimination, but that's nothing a little dramatization on the local news can't mask. Cue the waterworks.
It just still upsets me to just talk about it because I don't even feel safe. And that's just not fair. This shouldn't happen to anyone at all.
Oh, yes, it shouldn't happen to anyone at all, says the immigrant woman, given the opportunity of a lifetime at a cushy American college, who had to endure the horror of somebody asking her a question one time. Even as told, this story merits zero inquiry. There is no abuse. There is no crime. There is only a laughably soft person who needs to toughen up and count her blessings. But this isn't any normal context, of course. This is a college campus context. And so if any feelings are hurt, but especially precious pet minority feelings, all must suffer to accommodate. And so the college president apologized immediately for the school's ongoing legacy of racism and bias, where people of color are targeted while simply going about the business of their ordinary lives. She didn't even bother to speak to the accused. She just started making big sweeping new changes. New anti-bias training for all staff was announced, as well as new racially segregated dorms. And the janitor who called the campus police was placed on leave. What the school didn't do was wait 5 seconds for the results of an outside investigation they hired from a discrimination law firm. Months later, and much more quietly than the original story, in October 2018, that firm's report was published showing there was no need for such sweeping and immediate changes, because investigators found no evidence sufficient to show that this woman was discriminated against with respect to this incident. So what happened? Well, it turns out that this dorm lounge that the student was sitting in was closed at the time. It wasn't open to anybody. And so the presence of somebody would be something for campus security to deal with, since it was the janitor who first noticed the woman in the closed area, and since school guidance tells staff, like this janitor, to call campus police rather than to try to deal with the situation themselves. That is exactly what the janitor did. And this report doesn't just show that the original claims lacked sufficient evidence. It actually shows that several big pieces of the student's story were just outright lies. The student claimed she was targeted for, quote, eating while black. No, she was in a closed part of the school. She was targeted for unauthorized presence. She says she was reported as a, quote, suspicious black man. No. The transcript of the janitor's call made no racial references. She says the officer who confronted her was armed. Even if that was true, there's no demonstration that a weapon was unholstered, but it isn't true. Not only was this officer unarmed, but every campus security officer is. And it's one thing to lie about your own experience to make yourself a victim, but it's quite another to lie about somebody else to make them your victimizer. And that is exactly what this student did. She blamed a different janitor for the incident, a guy who wasn't even on campus at the time. She also blamed a cafeteria employee. And by blame, I don't mean she complained to the school administration privately about them. I mean, she outed them on social media, posting names, pictures, contact information, and calling them racist aggressors. And what was this cafeteria worker's supposed crime? She had simply reminded the student that the area was closed before the campus police got involved. She never even called the cops. She had simply given polite notice and nothing more, ironically fearful of student backlash if she pushed the issue too hard. And of course, not that anybody deserves to be falsely accused and prematurely punished, but consider the conditions of these particular falsely accused staffers. The cafeteria worker has lupus, a condition worsened by stress. The stress in this case caused her to check into a hospital after constant racism allegations, she claims. Stress that has continued as she's applied for other jobs after campus layoffs. When she was asked about being an accused racist at her prior job. The falsely accused janitor is a 58-year-old man who says he's had a history of anxiety, but this incident worsened it to a new level. And of course, the other janitor, who actually called campus police, prompting the whole incident, is an older man in his 60s with poor vision. He was removed from his job for months, though at least he was paid during that leave. But despite every piece of the original story being a lie, despite several innocent people being victimized by those lies, the unfalsifiable narrative lives on, and this story is still somehow evidence of a broader systemic racism problem. The New York Times ran a long piece this week that lays out all of the facts and the reasons why this woman's story was absolute bullshit. But the story frames it as, quote, a highlighting of the tensions between a student's deeply felt sense of personal truth and the facts that are at odds with it. Yeah, elegantly phrased, but fewer words can make the point. She's a damn liar. Even after the report was released, the college president says it validated the woman's lived experience. In particular, the fear she felt at the sight of the officer. It is impossible to rule out the potential role of implicit racial bias, she said. No, it isn't. We can rule out racial bias as a motive because there was a clear and reasonable motive otherwise. The area was closed. New York Times staffer Nicole Hannah-Jones says the story still holds validity because somehow the semi-blind janitor wields institutional power over the student. Yeah, this student holds absolutely no power at all, even though this entire expensive liberal arts college jumps at her command, even though the ACLU swoops in immediately to do her bidding, even though not just this college, but every college bends right over for her. She's now a grad student at Columbia studying what else? Racism as the cause of disparate health outcomes. But apparently no level of opportunity or prosperity can ever erase the inherent victimhood. Funny how useful that is. And by the way, the non-power of the ACLU is still standing behind her. The ACLU's racial justice director says, quote, "It's troubling that people are more offended by being called racist than by actual racism in our society." Substitute any crime in that statement and see if it makes any sense. You know, it's a real shame that people are more offended by false murder accusations than they are by actual murder in our society, as though it's one or the other, as though only one can be wrong, as though it's either wrong to kill or it's wrong to falsely accuse people of it. Why not both? Does the fact that murder happens mean it isn't wrong to falsely accuse someone of it? Or does the weight of that accusation mean that due process in investigating it is crucially important so we don't ruin more lives on top of the crime itself? And notice the racism referenced is just a given. Again, an unfalsifiable premise. No amount of evidence otherwise could ever disprove its presence. But what in this story demonstrates racism? Because it's not just an absence of evidence in this case. It's actually an abundance of evidence to the contrary. If this school or this country was systemically racist, we all would have laughed in this woman's face upon the initial accusation, which ironically would have been the factually correct response at the time. But we didn't do that. But instead, we coddled and accommodated her in every way possible. Her emotional whims took priority over the truth. And they still do. That isn't negative racial bias. That's positive racial preference to the point that even when she's a proven liar, we don't care and we still maintain that preference anyway. Things couldn't get any better for her, but we're still being told they couldn't get any worse. I wish I could ask these activists sincerely, what evidence would be sufficient for you to acknowledge that racism is no longer a large-scale problem in this country? What would that evidence look like? Because assuming this story isn't enough, it would have to be some beneficial treatment beyond a lady lying her way through America's highest learning institutions without consequence. That is preferential treatment in the most advanced opportunities in the world. And even that special privilege isn't enough for these activists to shed their victimhood. But the answer, of course, is none. There is no evidence sufficient. There is no such thing. Because this isn't about any sort of evidence-based observation of the world. It's just about a political tool to club you into submission and gain advancement. I accuse you of racism and I collect rewards. It's a very simple transaction, and that's why so many people continue to pursue it. And the only way to stop that arrangement is to stop the rewards. So how about this? How about we scrap that deal in favor of the classic one? You make an accusation and you get due process, and that's it. We'll investigate, we'll establish facts, and nobody gets rewarded or punished until those facts have been gathered and considered. Because nothing good has ever been decided by a crying contest, not campus policy, not the accuracy of a news piece, and certainly not the application of justice. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.